And we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is Random Acoustic Thoughts, and I've got a special guest, Joshua City from 86 Boxing. We're here to talk to you about a bout that I found, a previously unknown bout to my knowledge, that I found for the great Sam Langford. First of all, welcome, Josh City.
Thank you, Random. Salute and thank you for having me. This is groundbreaking. I do appreciate the fact that I'm one of the people you gave the call to join you in this discovery. History is something that leads us towards the future. Sometimes history repeats itself, as we know, but documenting said history is something that keeps us tied to the past in some form. And I think this is a great thing that you've discovered here, especially considering we're talking the sport of boxing, one of the most storied histories as far as sports is concerned in general. And you have been able to do something that very few have been able to truly document in this manner over the course of history. So I commend you for that and thank you for being here.
Uh, Thanks, brother. It's a pleasure having you. Yeah, so folks, Sam Langford fought from 1902 to 1926. He was born in Nova Scotia, Canada. He moved to Boston. I think he moved here around 1901. By 1902, he was he'd initially been like a janitor in, I think this is 1901. He was a janitor in the Lenox Athletic Club. At this time, the athletic clubs put on the bulk of boxing bouts. People would train out of there. They weren't necessarily allowed to sell tickets to fights in the US, but they would sell memberships to the athletic club, which would then put on fights. It was a little end run around the rules. Boxing was struggling for mainstream acceptance at this point. So Langford started fighting amateur in 1902. He also turned professional in 1902. And he got so the graphic here at the top, you see there's a clipping. He was actually, oh, hold on. I've got the wrong clipping up. Let me pull this beast up here real quick, just to give you guys some background. Goodness me. I've got, oh, here we go. So Langford, like, he had a very rapid rise. So by the end of 1903, he had already beaten one of the greatest fighters of all time, Joe Gans, over 15 rounds. But, at the beginning of the year, he basically had turned pro in April of 1902 against Jack McVicker, who he'd fought twice as an amateur, beaten twice as an amateur. But then his third fight at the Lenox Athletic Club, which was where he was based, got him suspended by the Athletic Association of, the Boxing Athletic Association. So then he had no choice but to remain as a pro. And that's what the graphic up there, the top of clipping is of. And they actually have J. McVickers. Sometimes in this time, the actual names, McVickers, sometimes they don't always get it exactly spot on. But we know this is the same guy. It was the same night they fought. This is from 3 days later. They got suspended. So now he's a full pro. And he goes on, he's a pretty busy guy. And his known fights, I believe he had 27 known fights in 1903. We can now chalk that up to 28 known fights in 1903. But before we get into the specifics of this and just touch briefly on this fight and the circumstances surrounding it, Josh, would you like to just give like maybe a brief overview of the general shape, the overarching shape of Langford's career? He's a hard guy to sum up, but you want to just give it a try?
Yeah, so he is one person that I haven't done a video on, a singular video, that is, though he is in the mix with the number of individuals that I have done a video on, just thinking about the history and the era he was in. And really, he extended beyond just a single era because he crossed paths with a number of the greatest fighters over a 20 plus year period. And summing his career up in a single video is probably one of the hardest things that I think can be done. And that's one of the reasons that I actually haven't done a video on Sam Langford specifically. And even with the thought of such, I had reached out to you because I know that you have put in a lot of time and work researching Sam Langford. And I feel that me just doing a video on him alone wouldn't be doing the proper justice when I can connect with someone like yourself, maybe some others who have dug into him, and get a bit more info and insight from a different perspective. So that's the approach that I know that we've discussed in the near future, surely some point in the future, maybe here in 2023, some point later in the year. I'd imagine that you and I will finally connect on that structure and what we intend to do as far as the video series on Sam Langford. But this is a man who I had heard about in spurts over the years, especially once I got more into the history of boxing, and I didn't know a ton about him. It was just a name I heard. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people who are more on the casual side of boxing. When you think of Sam Langford, this is a person who I've heard the name. Seems like he may have been a good fighter. Historians may have mentioned such. Some of the other boxing minds may have mentioned such, modern boxing minds, that is. I may have seen a thing or two mentioned on him for TV. That's probably what goes to the mind of the casual boxing fan. And even for some, they probably have no idea who he is. But if you have just a smidget of the understanding of history, you'll probably at the very least know the name. Now, it took me years, even at this point, I'm still learning. It took me years to get to the point where I understand the actual greatness of this fighter. And like yourself, like many others who truly understand where his career started and where it ended, this lends to that notion that this may very well be the greatest fighter we have ever seen. And I doubt that we'd even get anyone who comes anywhere near that, just given the way the structure and the way boxing in modern times has morphed. And I think that's probably the greatest compliment we could give Sam Langford. Now, there are others who have remarkable careers that kind of mirror his in terms of maybe longevity and the number of fights, some who exceed it. But as far as being an individual who rose from one of the lower weights, I can't remember, it might have been lightweight, or even a little bit below that, which is 135 pounds. That's what lightweight is. But anyway, he was essentially a knockout artist, you can say, at lightweight, and he rose all the way to heavyweight while giving up crazy amounts of pounds. We're talking 60, 50, 40. It didn't matter. He was giving up crazy amounts as far as the advantage for the opponent, but he was still able to knock out a heavyweight who were much larger than him, and he carried that type of pop. And when we say pop, we think about guys who just naturally can punch, can naturally hit, and naturally put fighters down or get them alarmed. He had that all the way from lightweight up to heavyweight. And the modern example we have is Manny Pacquiao, who started somewhere around the flyweight, uh, that weight class at least, and rose all the way up to 147 pounds, the welterweight division, and he was able to stop some guys at welterweight. But that was a big jump for him, and he was able to carry a good deal of that power. And we saw it, and we were able to witness that live. Now, imagine if Manny Pacquiao went up to light heavyweight or cruiserweight, and that's what you kind of get in your mind when thinking about the career of Sam Langford, and not to mention the amount of names on his resume as far as historically great fighters that he took on. And he fought even when he was well past his prime, and he was still able to defeat top caliber fighters blind in both eyes at one point. And it didn't stop him. He never got his world title shot in any of the weight classes, which is a travesty in itself, though he was able to pick up the colored world titles. And that in itself is one of the reasons that I know myself, you, others like Scrapbook, Boxing Librarian, and a vast amount of others, we recognize those titles because even though he didn't get a chance at the world heavyweight champion or world light heavyweight champion, etc., we know that he at one point was essentially the best fighter in the world, period. And history has allowed us here in modern time to be able to track this in a way that they couldn't do so back then, but they were still able to at least provide documentation via print. And we have a little bit of video of them as well, at least that has survived. They were still able to provide this information and be able to annotate such as we moved on over the course of time. So you can look back at some old articles from the early and mid 1900s, and you'll see that individuals of the time even recognize him as the greatest fighter. So that's probably a general way of summing up Sam Langford, though it doesn't do justice to the man in the career of Sam Langford. But if you're able to construct a fighting machine, or if AI, if you use artificial intelligence to build a fighter just based on the history of the sport, surely Sam Langford would be the end product.
Yeah, well put, my friend. And yeah, just Xavier, the boxing nerd, big shout out there, doing great work on YouTube. I mean, on Wikipedia, just to update the records, including the newspaper decisions. Briefly, certain states, if no one got knocked out, you weren't allowed to render a decision, which was like a way to curb betting. So the newspaper men in attendance would rate the fight. And these days we take sort of a conglomerate of their opinions and use that like a panel of judges. So a newspaper decision was basically who got the best of it. And people could bet on that, on the like the local newspaper writer who he thought won. They've been trying to stamp out betting since betting existed, and they always find a way around it. People love to bet on fights. It raises the stakes, makes a lot of fun. But yeah, Xavier just pointed out that Langford did fight for the welterweight championship of the world. That was against the great Barbados Joe Walcott. That was in 1904. He was also given 2 opportunities to fight for the lightweight world title, but he didn't actually fight for the title. He fought the great Joe Gans, the old master, one of the greatest fighters that ever lived, certainly one of the most influential fighters of all time. Fought him at the end of 1903, but he was 2 pounds over the agreed. So the weight class was, I think, 133 at this time, lightweight, but people could challenge at different weights, especially if they were forced to weigh in right before they fought. So the agreement with Gans was 138 ringside. He only made 140, so he beat Joe Gans, which was an incredible win. But he didn't get the title for it, in spite of it. The day after they reported he was the new champion, then it came out, no, he was 2 pounds over the agreed weight. And then he got a rematch with Gans in 1904, but he announced a couple days before he couldn't make 138 ringside. And so Gans fought young kid Griffo in a challenge match. If you can last 10 rounds, you can take the winner's end of the purse. And the athletic club was actually going to give this kid $100 for every round. Past 10 he could last. He didn't. I think he went out in the 7th or 8th. But so Langford got a few title opportunities. He only actually fought for the title with the title on the line once. He got a little bit the best of it round by round, but the ref called it a draw because Barbados Walcott was a serious fighter, and at the end of the fight he came on strong the last few rounds. So, and it was the ref's decision. There was no judges in that fight. So Langford got the best of one of the who I would consider the greatest lightweight of all time, certainly a top 3 of all time, Joe Gans. And he also beat one of the all-time great welterweights in spirit, but he didn't actually get the decision in that fight. Although if nowadays, if it was like a panel of judges round by round, he would, under the 10-point must, he would have actually had the welterweight title. But in those days, back in the early 1900s, it was a little more freeform, and that's worth keeping in mind when we're talking about newspaper decisions. And there were draws sometimes where one guy did get the edge of it, but the draw, if you didn't like conclusively win, some refs would just make it a draw. There were also pre-agreed draws, which Langford participated in, where by pre-agreement between the management of the fighters, or sometimes even like the jurisdiction, if nobody was knocked out, the fight was a draw. And that just meant you know, in financial terms, that meant you would split the money evenly. If they didn't have a set purse beforehand and they were just like going off the gate, prearranged draw means if you don't knock me out, I still get half that money. So it's a very complicated thing dealing with records. This new fight that I found of Langford's, I don't have the result. I only have proof that the fight happened. Now, this is way, way back in 1903. Now, to close out 1903, Langford was proclaimed by the Boston Post, which was arguably the major newspaper in New England, as a New England champion. There he is in the middle. But that wasn't based on beating the great Joe Gans, you know, just a number of days before this came out. That was based on beating all the local lads. So at this time, you know, the kind of schedules, boxers would fight seasons. And to be considered the local or regional champion, you had to beat the local lads. It wasn't a given just because you had won at a world class level like Langford had at this point, beating Joe Gans, who was the, you know, like he was the champion, the only champion at that weight, the best in the world. So sort of an interesting texture this times, and I found when I was researching all of this, it gets very complicated very quickly. It's a very nuanced method you have to go about judging a career. It's not like today where you say this guy's the champ and he's beating the contenders who are ranked by the Ring or Transnational or whoever the rankings you go by, the different orgs. It's not like that. This was not the Wild West, but the champions had practically all of the leverage at this point. And you could do an awful lot of fighting. You could even have a lot of world-class wins, and people would still have question marks about you. Even after Langford beat Gans over 15 rounds, got the clear decision over Gans, some papers would still refer to him as a prospect. He was still an up-and-comer to some people because one win on that level didn't necessarily mean you were unquestionably the best. You had to prove it and prove it and prove it. In fact, even Gans, as the only world champion at that weight, still had to prove it. There were still people who were like, because he had fought in the 1800s as well, some people had said, oh, he's gone back. He's not what he used to be. And certain writers actually used his loss to Langford and also a 6 rounds loss to Jack Blackburn, another great of this era who later coached Joe Louis. The great Jack Blackburn, the fact that, you know, Langford and Blackburn had gotten the best of Gans, even though he had this magnificent year-to-year record, they were saying, oh, he's gone back and you can't consider him a championship proposition. So the writers were extremely skeptical in these days. It's not like today where the promotions practically fund the websites and fund these writers and they write on their behalf. And these days, the writers they were speaking to the betting public and to the ticket buying public, and the managers playing games actually ticked off the writers. They didn't appreciate being tools because they were actually speaking on behalf of the sport and the passionate people who were following and paying for the sport, not the promoters who were making money off it, not the fighters. So in spite of all-time great wins at this time, like, you know, Langford, once he beat Gans today, they would be like, look, you just beat one of the greatest ever. You're world class, right? At this time, you know, he still hadn't proven himself, but we're going to actually rewind even further than December 1903. We're actually going to go all the way back to February 1903. Now, Langford had fought once as a professional. Like I say, he had 3 amateur bouts, which he won. He won an amateur tournament. Then he had a special bout against the guy, Jack McVicker, who he beat to win the amateur tournament. This was at the Roanoke Club in Boston. The April that year, he turns pro against McVicker. He gets suspended by the Amateur Athletic Union for basically having to them an unsanctioned bout against McVicker. So he turns pro, and so now he's stuck as a pro. And then he had multiple fights booked that didn't actually happen, including during 1902. I think he was supposed to fight. I've got a graphic for that somewhere. Hold on a second, folks. My apologies. Let's have a look here. Yeah, so he was going to fight Billy Pratt. He was going to fight Spike Haley. He was going to fight King Ringgold, among others. I don't have evidence of those fights actually happening, unless I'm just off in my head. Those are 3 of the bouts that were booked and didn't necessarily happen. But what we're going to talk about right here, behold, this definitely happened. This was in the Boston Post. This was, I believe, this was in the February 25th, 1903 edition of the Boston Post, talking about the night before the Berkeley Cycle Club in Beechmont. Beechmont is a section, I believe it's considered part of Revere, Massachusetts. That's on the North Shore. So that's the shore of the Massachusetts Bay, north of the city of Boston. And Beechmont was I won't get into the origins of Beechmont, but basically it was a community on the coast. In modern days, it's just north of a nature preserve, and on State Road, which is and again, like, I'm gonna do a more detailed video with Josh coming up maybe in the next week or two. We won't get into that, but we're gonna get into whole maps, and I'm gonna try and find a photo of the old building. We're gonna go deep, but just for this, which is more of an announcement video, and just from give me an opportunity to rant, because the only person I told was BL. Until today, the only person I told was the Boxing Librarian, who was like, I don't know if he's my mentor, but this is the man who inspired me to research boxing history. So we're just touching on it today because I had to tell someone else, and that's everybody. So the Berkeley Cycle Club, they did what's known as a smoke talk. And a smoke talk in these days was, in part, it was used as an end run around, people trying to, certain towns and cities saying you couldn't have boxing. They said, well, this isn't boxing. This is a smoke talk. We're getting together. We're going to smoke some cigars. We're going to listen to music. We're going to watch some this. We're going to do some this and that together, but really like a social club. But boxing in certain smoke talks, certain towns got really upset because it was being used as a reason to basically just put on a night of fights. This particular night, they listened to some music and they sang some songs and recitations. I don't know if that's poetry or readings. They had boxing bouts, and they also had wrestling bouts. This is from the Boston Sunday Post. I mean, not the Sunday Post. This is from the Boston Post. And I think this fight happened on a Tuesday. He also fought that Friday, if I'm not mistaken. He fought one of his 3 bouts against Luther Manuel. But I also found just today, right before we went on, I found in the Revere Journal, a separate archive from the conglomerate archive that I subscribe to, goes into just a tiny bit more detail. So the wrestling bouts, they had catch wrestling, catch as catch can, which I believe includes submissions basically. But they also had Greco-Roman wrestling, and the catch wrestling. It says Paddington and Jarvis of the EBAA. Now, Jarvis is the last name of young Jarvis, who Langford boxed that night. But I don't know if it's the same guy, to be honest. That's something I haven't found yet. In the Post article, it says young Jarvis, but then the wrestler is only called Jarvis. Both are Boston, but so it's hard to say. It's not necessarily maybe a rare last name at this point. But anyway, we know this fight happened. We know that this happened here. Oh, I pulled up the wrong other graphic. There we go. Bring the Post back up. So we know this happened. And Josh City, how many times in your research, your research of the early era of boxing, how many times have you come up against people who have 28 outings in a single year? I know Harry Greb did it, and Ted Kid Lewis, Jack Britton. I'm sure those guys did it. But how frequent is it that you would see someone have 28 fights in their first year, ignoring that this is his first full season?
Yeah, great question. Hard to think about it off top outside of some of the bigger names like what you mentioned. Of course, he himself. You had Harry Greb, who of course went 45-0 in 1 year, and actually shortly, or the extent of that was he actually went 52-0, leading to the other early part of that next year. So you have him, 28. That's a big number there, and I'd imagine there may have been some others, but yeah, outside of those two off top, I really can't think of anyone. Maybe Lynn Wickwar, who apparently has the most fights in history. I haven't dove into his record to that degree, but maybe him. Then you think about some others who had a number of fights that probably weren't documented in the same fashion. I think about Jimmy Wilde, who his fight total was narrowed down per se as far as what's been documented and recorded, but I know that he was fighting at a more extensive pace than what has been recorded in history, especially early in his career. Some of it just really kind of that carnival like, almost battle royal like stuff that took place with some of the other fighters, some of the black fighters during the latter part of the 1800s. But man, getting to those type of numbers, that's a feat in itself. You know, we see boxers here in the modern day, some of them, they have a career that may be 28 fights or maybe 30, 32 fights. So when you really put that into perspective, yeah, it's just really an amazing thing, and it won't be duplicated.
Yeah, great point. It's just that because of like mandatory layoffs between bouts, sanctioned bouts under the commissions today, it's, you know, if you're forced to take 2 weeks off after a fight, which I think is what's generally the rule. I'm not sure about the amateurs, but I think in the pros, I think it's 2 weeks is a minimum, even if you didn't get touched. You know, 28 times, that's, you know, you double that, you're talking about more weeks than there are in a year. So really, we're not going to see it today. But back in these days, you could do it. They would also, you know, professionals would have different lengths of bouts. So like Langford, some of his early fights, they weren't all 12 rounders, but he didn't spend years before fighting 12 rounds, just that people had so many fights. So let me pull up this graphic. And actually, this graphic is now obsolete because I only have 27 of Langford's fights. He actually had, you know, I'm not sure what the result was yet. I'm going to try and dig that up if it's ever mentioned. But so you could say, actually, these four men, the great Joe Gans, Sam Langford there, Dave Hawley. Dave Hawley fought a lot of 6-round bouts, not exclusively, but he had a whole slew of 6-round bouts, as did Jack Blackburn on the right there. And they were both considered top men, especially over short distances. Certain greats in boxing history, they specialized in a certain length of a fight. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, one of the great light heavyweights, but also he was a great middleweight and one of the great multi-weight fighters. He fought a who's who, right? His resume is ridiculous. But a lot of those bouts were over 6 rounds. He was like a specialist, arguably one of the top 5 all-time great over 6 rounds. And it's a certain kind of pace that people can put over 6 rounds where maybe they can push their energy levels for technique and their output without worrying about round 10, round 12, round 15. So, you know, sometimes fantasy matchups, historical fantasy matchups, don't take into account like what someone's specialty was. Just like you could say, well, okay, Jack O'Brien's a great light heavyweight. Would he beat Ezra Charles over 15 rounds? Well, maybe not. Or Archie Moore, or all the great light heavyweights, maybe not. But could they beat him over 6 rounds? It's hard to say. And same with, like, say, Sam Langford. Like, you could say, oh, would Langford beat, you know, Rocky Marciano over 15 rounds? It's hard to say. But would Marciano beat Langford over 20 rounds? Because Langford fought a bunch of 20-round fights. So if you've never seen someone go into rounds, you know, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, all that extra fighting, it's hard to say. And, you know, people judge greatness differently. Everyone has their own subjective way of measuring it. But like personally, I do take into account how rough some of the fights were. It's not just a numerical thing. It's not a video game. It's not just about stats. Like 2 of Langford's great rivals, the great Joe Jeanette on the left and the also great Sam McVeigh on the right there, the Oxnard Cyclone, you know, their longest fight went 49 rounds, 49 3-minute rounds. So in Paris in 1909, and they fought 3 times that year. They boxed 99 professional rounds against each other, 2 of the greatest in 1 year. Those 3 fights, you know, a 20-round fight, a 30-round fight, and a 49-round fight. You can't, you know, I personally, that's not just a number 1 next to the record in the win of the that's like an incredible bout right there. So Langford never fought that long, and the fights, you know, some of his fights were scheduled for, say, 25 rounds or 45. I think his 3rd fight with Fireman Jim Flynn, California, in 1910 was scheduled for 45, and but it didn't last that. It lasted like 7 or 8. So Langford was one of the great finishers, and again, with the stats compared to the reality, Langford had, well, I thought it was 314. I guess at least 315 known fights now. You know, so if you have a 50% finishing rate on paper, you'd be like, oh, what's that mean? You know, look at these other guys. Yeah, but he had I don't think he quite had a 50% rate, but like he had 100, almost 130 knockouts that we know about in his career. And that's what puts it in perspective. It's not just a percentage. It's like, what did he actually do? And the opening salvo to his career was insane. And his schedule stayed crazy, although it wasn't always 28 bouts. Like the next year, he had 14 fights that we know about so far. I'm going to be digging. Trust me, folks. I'm going to be digging. We're going to try and find more. I saw an article in 1912 when he was in Australia, where I think he said he had about 183 or 187, something like that, fights. And he was saying how Jim Barry was tough and he'd only been knocked down 3 times in all those fights. And that was one of them was by Barry, but I think it was Jim Barry or Porky Dan Flynn, one of the two. But that's not the number that's on BoxRec or Cyber Boxing Zone. So there are fights missing now, assuming he wasn't embellishing. But certainly, like I just found one more. So there's one more than we knew about. And this is in his formative, you know, and he was so busy you can't say formative years, even though it would be maybe 1908 before he would considered one of the top 2 heavyweights in the world. The year Jack Johnson beat Tommy Burns for, you know, to unify the colored world title and the basically what was the white title. Langford was the top contender, and he was actually supposed to fight Jack Johnson in May of 1909 at the National Athletic Club in London, but Johnson, I don't want to say chickened out, but Johnson refused to fight, raised his price, and never gave Langford a shot, even though he held the belt all the way till 1915. So Langford didn't get his opportunity because of the specifics of the era, but he was the top 2 heavyweight in the world for years. And this is a man who started fighting down at, so the amateur fights were at 135 pounds. And I think 133 was the official weight for lightweight in those years. But oftentimes, he didn't often make 133. Oftentimes, it would be instead of like you weigh in the afternoon or the day before, like you weigh in right before you go in, maybe with a couple pounds allowance. Like when he fought Gans, I was at 138. By the next year, he was a welterweight contender, which I think was 142 in those days. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was around 142 or 141. But again, he would fight even above that weight. You know, in 1905, he's fighting middleweights, and he has his first fight against a great heavyweight, his first fight against Joe Jeanette. 1906, he fights Jeanette again and beats him this time. Fights and loses over 15 rounds to the great Jack Johnson. Langford's still walking around, you know, just above what today's welterweight limit will be. He's already fighting great heavyweights. And that's something that separates him. You know what I mean, Josh? Like he's set apart by the size of his cojones, not just a win-loss record or any kind of stats or anything like that. He was fighting far above. He wasn't supposed to even last the length with Johnson. So he got cheers in that fight with Johnson for going 15 rounds, giving up 30 or more pounds to a great heavyweight, to the colored world champion. Just crazy. And Josh, let me throw it back to you because I know I'm rambling. I blame beer and enthusiasm, but so again, like with Langford, there are other great fighters who've given up significant weight over time. Is there anyone you've encountered in your studies who did it to that degree? I know like there's like Barbados Walcott, and like I said, Jimmy Wilde, when he was doing like the fairground fights and stuff, he would knock out grown men. But at the high levels, who can you think of who would really give up significant weight on the regular, the way Langford ended up doing so?
Yeah, I think that 2 of the best that you are those that you just mentioned. Jimmy Wilde is certainly one who at times weighed about 90 pounds and he was fighting guys who were around 112 pounds, etc. He is someone who definitely had to make a career of being the smaller guy. And with that, he was also able to knock out a lot of his opponents. He racked up a ton of knockouts. Uh, just thinking about that, he definitely deserves nods in that regard. Of course, Barbados Joe, he was someone who was willing to face pretty much anyone, and he would take on individuals or just heavyweights is one we want to name. He would at least attempt to take on heavyweights, but individuals in general who not only were bigger than him in weight, but in height, with him being only 5'1", and this didn't deter him. He continued to move forward. he didn't have a problem with doing such. When you think about another great one, certainly Bob Fitzsimmons is a fighter that comes to mind, who the first three-weight world champion. He rose to heavyweight, and there were times in which he would take on bigger guys. As a matter of fact, he was outboxing James J. Jeffries pretty much in both fights, but he ended up being knocked out as time went on. Time went on in those fights. Jeffries, of course, who was a bigger, stronger fighter and had a lot of endurance, and he could take a punch. So that helped him withstand what it was that Fitzsimmons could offer. So Fitzsimmons is another one of those who definitely has to be mentioned amongst those. When you think about, let me see, other individuals, taking it back to or taking it to uh, modern times. I noticed that Xavier, the boxing nerd, pointed out Deontay Wilder. That is very much true. He generally comes in well below some of the other heavyweights that he faces. He was 214, I believe, in that first fight with Fury. Maybe similarly along those lines, but a little bit more in the second fight. So he's a good example. And regardless of such, he's been able to carry that pop, that punch that has been able to see him through. So that is definitely one worth mentioning for sure. Think about uh, Vasily Lomachenko at times. He's been one of the smaller individuals in there, even though he's continually made that move up. But even moving up to lightweight, there are a number of opponents, some who he intends to face, who are bigger than him when you look at their overall size and what they probably walk around at. And I think that's worth noting for sure. Alexander Usyk, he's a modern example of one of the smaller heavyweights just based on what we generally see within those top ranks at this particular juncture in the heavyweight division, with him being 6'3". I would say, probably is around 215, 220 for that weight range, but we know he rose from cruiserweight. He wasn't a big puncher at cruiserweight, and he's not a big puncher at heavyweight. That being said, he has the overall ability to be able to withstand some of these bigger guys that he's facing. And it was always a question of how would he look in rising to heavyweight, and size was one of those main factors, but he hasn't let that deter him, and he's looked pretty much as good as ever being in there with those bigger guys, and he's really going to put this to the test when he takes on Tyson Fury, because as we know, Tyson Fury 6'9", probably is going to come in around 270, somewhere in that range, and Usyk is going to have to prepare and work towards being able to stop that. So those are just a few examples. We look back in history, I'm sure there are a ton of others. I think about Carmen Basilio rising up from welterweight to beat Sugar Ray Robinson. And Basilio, yeah, you look at him, he's not a huge guy, but he had that tenacity, that toughness that allowed him to be able to withstand what was offered by Sugar Ray Robinson, who probably wasn't, at his peak, wasn't the best he had been when he was a little bit, or when he was down in some of the lower weights. But that being said, that was still a great win given what Basilio had to go through to be able to defeat him. So those are a few examples that are out there, but I'm sure there are more. People know some in the chat. Feel free to drop them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was shouting out. I was in the chat shouting out Hyphy and Rodolfo and Xavier, and just thanks to anyone who stops by now, but also listen after the fact. It doesn't really matter in the end, unless you need to interact. It doesn't matter when you watch. Just thanks for watching. It's great to have you here, talking about this old school stuff. And this is some real deep level nerd stuff right here, because this is, Langford's been dead, I don't even know how many years. 50s, was it? So this is like far after the fact, but this is important. structurally, Langford was a very important figure structurally in the sport. Even like in early 1904, young fighter, and I think it might have actually been Kid Ringgold, who Langford was supposed to fight the year before, died in the ring or died shortly after a fight. The authorities in boxing banned fights. Part of the reason Langford only had 14 so far known fights in 1904 was because he no longer had the Lenox Athletic Club in Boston where he was based, and his manager was helped run it, Joe Woodman. He no longer had that because they closed. They closed that spring. That spring they announced they would close the summer. It was a hot summer, quote unquote, but really it was because the authorities were stamping down on boxing. We'll do some content on that, get into the whole politics of the struggle for boxing survival. I think heading into this season, we're talking about 1903. I think 24 states allowed boxing in the U.S., but every state had boxing. A lot of stuff happened in private. Sometimes in the papers, like with Joe Gans, the great champion, they would announce that he was going to fight in private. It would be in a jurisdiction that allowed it. But this also happened in jurisdictions that forbade boxing. You can't stop people fighting, can't stop people betting on it. And so that's probably what accounts for a lot of the unknown bouts of Langford, is he would just fight, like this fight here. I've never heard anyone mention it. I haven't seen it on any website, and I don't remember seeing it anywhere. I could be wrong, but I don't remember seeing it anywhere. But it's there in two different sources. It's in the Revere Journal as part of a smoke talk, and it's in the Boston Post, a major newspaper. Just hadn't been dug up and the information organized. I'm actually going to reach out to BoxRec and Cyber Boxing Zone and say, hey, I don't have a result, but I got a fight here. It's listed as a bout. It's not an exhibition of sparring. Now, sometimes the word exhibition, it could be used in multiple ways. I've seen writers in bouts that were to a decision say a wonderful exhibition of boxing, and they've also seen like the action described as wonderful sparring, but during a fight that had a conclusive finish. It's not sparring like these aren't real fights. So this to here where they call it a bout, I haven't seen anything called a bout that wasn't an official fight. So I'm fairly confident this was a real fight. This wasn't just a demonstration. This was an actual fight. I just don't have a result yet, but I'm going to keep looking. I got to go through the various towns in New England. I have to start looking at like their library or their historical preservation society records rather than just these conglomerate digital archives that I've been using so far. I pay to subscribe to two separate ones. But Langford, he at this time in his career, he wasn't giving up weight, but he gave up some weight. I mean, he fought guys who were 200, 220, 230. Battling Jim Johnson here, I think he went as high as 240 in his career. Langford didn't care. He showed early in his career he would fight above his weight, but it got silly. And even after his prime, he was giving up huge weight sometimes. Even though he was half blind, he's blind in one eye, and he was going blind in the other eye during each fight, and he would get his sight back over the next few days. I mean, the first time, so I'll put it this, like the first time he met the great Sam McVeigh on the right there, they fought in 1911. They fought twice that year. They fought in Paris, and then they fought in Sydney. The first fight, he gave up 40 pounds to Sam McVeigh. He came in at 161, which is actually lower than he'd already weighed in at in other fights. He was in superb shape. 161. McVeigh was, I think, 201 and a quarter or something like that. He made Sam McVeigh fight on the retreat in that fight. Sam McVeigh was a knockout specialist with both hands. He made McVeigh, with 40-pound advantage, fight him on the retreat. That's how hard Langford learned to hit in his career. And part of that is he had good training. And his hero was Bob Fitzsimmons. And his main, early in his career, his key trainers was bantamweight Jimmy Walsh, who also fought out of the Lenox Athletic Club. Langford opened up for him, and he fought in the preliminaries of Walsh fights, and I think sometimes Walsh even fought on Langford's preliminaries. I think the night that in England that Langford fought, I think it was his bout with Tiger Smith, a Welshman who I think was an army person who served in India, but it was considered for the English middleweight championship. Langford beat Tiger Smith, who was a southpaw. I think Walsh actually fought Owen Moran that night on the undercard for the title, and he lost that fight. But Langford was a heavy favorite and did actually school Smith. Like he basically carried him until the bets came in, so he could make some extra money, and then smacked him around, finished it off. But Langford had unusual power, but that was learned through technique. That wasn't just that he was a tough kid who'd been out living on his own since his early teens because he left an abusive household. So I think he left home at 13. So, when he started fighting a few years later, he'd done a lot of manual labor. He'd had to keep himself safe with his own hands. He was a tough kid. He was born to fight, but he also had a very hard life. But he had excellent training. Walsh was a very technical, top fighter. This article page I have here from the Boston Post at the end of 1903. Langford actually had one more fight after this, but this came out what they thought was pretty much the end of the season. He had just beaten Joe Gans. Jimmy Walsh is right there over on the right as the bantamweight champion of New England. And, Langford had also had basically a points win over the greatest lightweight of possibly of all time, but certainly of that era. It wasn't until Benny Leonard that people would even consider another lightweight to have a resume comparable to Joe Gans. And Benny Leonard is, to me, he's the number 2 all time. Him and Gans are the top guys. A lot of people would have Roberto Duran, but if you look at their fights at the highest levels, really Gans and Leonard separate themselves just to a remarkable degree. As far as how good someone is, like who wins in a fight, I don't know. But in the resume, I don't think you can top Gans and Leonard. But Langford, even though he beat Gans, that doesn't mean he has a better resume at lightweight or he was a greater lightweight. He just won that one fight. He had some other lightweight work, but by 1904, he's now contending for the welterweight championship. He fights the great Barbados Joe Walcott to a draw and fights some other guys at welterweight and also at middleweight. And Walcott himself, like when Walcott, early in his career in the early 1890s, Walcott, when he was still a lightweight, he was fighting middleweights. And then by the time he was a welterweight, he's challenging heavyweights and he's fighting, middleweights and what would be light heavy now and heavyweights even. He had an open challenge. His manager put a forfeit in the newspaper, Barbados Walcott's manager, that he would beat anyone that Jim Jeffries had beaten and faster. And this is a guy who probably walked around under 150. He fought down at like 141, 142, but he walked around at less than 150 pounds, and he was willing to fight basically in the open weight category. And in this day, contrary to what people think, there were some big fellas. Okay, boxing had a huge draw, the money available. So maybe there are more big people today, but the percentage of big people that want to go and be boxers was exponentially larger. So there's some big fellas that would come in. Langford was of that, of that temperament in the Barbados Walcott temper. And Joe Gans as well fought above his weight, just not to the same degree. Walcott and Langford went up to heavy. And Langford, eventually even outgrew where he wasn't going to fight Walcott. He was too big for the lightweights and welterweights, and even most of the middleweights in the world. It was out of the question fighting him. They would openly bar him. And so he was fighting that guy's light heavyweight size and even heavyweights. And in 1906, when he was still, he gave up 30 pounds to the great Jack Johnson. And he got, like I said, he got cheers from the crowd from lasting the distance. Part of the reason he could do so well is he had excellent technique. They had learned from Jimmy Walsh, also from George Byers. George Byers was a fellow Canadian who had held the colored middleweight and the colored heavyweight championship in his career, but he was past it by the time Langford started fighting. Byers was on the way out, even though he was still described as clever in the newspapers. Like 1904, or 1903, I think that picture's from not the photo, but the picture was published in 1903 article in the Boston Post calling him a clever middleweight. But he actually held heavyweight honors for the colored fighters. And so these two guys were instrumental in giving Langford for the technique, and that's part of where his hitting power came from, and that's multiplied by the experience. And Josh can attest to this. A lot of these great fighters, their highest level work is largely what people determine for their legacy, but the volume of work does also count. The adversity someone faces, because we see it today. People see a bad style matchup, and you can be a heavy underdog and get your butt kicked. Look what happened to Joshua when he fought Ruiz. Big Baby Miller pulled out of the fight. He got busted on the roids, pulled out of the fight. Ruiz comes in and beats Joshua. He wasn't a favorite in that fight by any means, even though he was a good fighter with a good record. Wasn't expected to win that fight, short notice. But he did anyway. It was a bad style matchup, and Joshua came in, maybe took him lightly, and that happened. It was said that Joe Gans took Langford lightly, but we're talking months before he even fought Gans. You can see here, so with our new updated fight against Jarvis at the Berkeley Bicycle Club in in Beachmont. Because I think Beachmont was its own community that time, and now it's considered, I believe, part of Revere, Massachusetts. But at that time, I believe it was its own place. I could be wrong about that, but he had 9 fights in those first 3 months of 1903, and that we know he had 4 fights the year before, 3 amateur, 1 pro. But he had 9 fights in those 3 months, and then from here we would go on and like he'd had 3 fight series with Luther Manuel. Apparently, those were very good fights, and they fought pretty evenly in their first 2 fights, and they were at different. Like the first 2 fights were at the Lenox. No, I'm sorry. The first fight was at the Essex. It was so good they booked him at the Lenox, and then they rematched the Lenox again in the trilogy fight over a longer fight over 10 rounds. And then he beat Sadler Pocahontas Jennings, who has a marginal record on BoxRec, but I've seen him reports of him having a lot of experience and years in the game, so it's probably just a fighter that hasn't been researched. Then he fought Johnny Johnson, and I'm gonna throw it back to you in a second, Josh. But just want to mention about Johnny Johnson. So Johnny Johnson, the year before, had won the amateur tournament at 145 pounds the same night that Langford won the tournament at 135 pounds. So if we're talking about a guy who's only months into like the busy part of his career, because he took months off after, I don't know if it was because of suspension or because he, like in his memoirs, he said he went up to New Hampshire to logging. And then it got cold in New Hampshire, and he remembered why he didn't want to do manual labeler anymore. But I don't know if that's just his reminiscences or if that's actually what happened or if it had something to do with suspension. It's not known at this point. But just months into the busy part of his thing, he's fighting the guy, the amateur champion from the weight class above where he was while he's still at that earlier weight class. He's still fighting around 135, 133, 135. So he fights Johnson to a draw. Then he fights John Butler, who is, I think, another fighter who had more experience than what you would see on BoxRec. In actuality, it had more fights. From there, it goes crazy. I'm not even going to get into that, but his Langford's fight schedule is bizarrely epic. And it starts off epic in volume, and then he's fighting, like I said, he's fighting above his weight, and he's fighting guys with more experience than him and more years in the game. And then it just goes absolutely crazy, which we're going to touch on in other fights. The main reason for this was just I wanted to bring Josh in because he does so much great work about boxing history and just talk about having found just another fight for Sam Langford, just another fight. And a lot of times, if you do even hear about Langford, it'll be about being one of the great heavyweights. Even though he was avoided during his prime by Jack Johnson, he fought great heavyweights, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and a bunch of other great fighters, Harry Wilde, in long series, and then some lesser numbers of fights against other great fighters across multiple weights. He has the most fights against Hall of Famers in history by far. And he's the second most wins, because in his era, the most wins is Harry Greb, but in Langford's era, there were more draws. And so Langford has a tremendous dozens of draws in his record. Some of those draws, he actually got the best of the guy, reported as such, but he didn't get the official verdict. The ref called it a draw. But Langford has a resume that I put him up in the top 3 all time at heavyweight because of the amount of high-level work he did. He had more high-level fights at heavyweight than Joe Louis or Muhammad Ali. He had more Hall of Fame fights at heavyweight than those guys combined. It's just really bizarre. It's a ridiculous. If you want to learn more about Sam Langford's career, visit Hardline Boxing Talk. That's the Boxing Librarian's channel. He does some statistical analysis of Langford and talks about his career in depth. Just search for Hardline Boxing Talk, Sam Langford, and enjoy. Also check out Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs. Just search Scrapbook Boxing, Sam Langford. He talks at length about Langford. Those are great channels for that. But this primarily, I know we're going far and wide, and like Josh said earlier, it's hard to sum up a career like this. That's why I threw it to him to try, because I wasn't even going to try. I just tried to talk about one aspect, and I just went 10 minutes in a row. But what we're talking about is like the very, very early parts of the early part of his career. Because he hadn't hit his prime when he beat Joe Gans and when he was the New England champion. He hadn't hit his prime when he got the best of Barbados Walcott in 2004. He hadn't hit his prime when he got the best when he lost to Joe Jeanette, but when he was fighting and sometimes beating or drawing with top middleweights in 1905. He wasn't in his prime when he fought the great Jack Johnson in 1906 and lasted 15 rounds, giving up 30 pounds to an all-time great. And when he beat the great Joe Jeanette in 1906, he hadn't hit his prime. In 1907, he's getting there. By 1908, he's hit his early prime, and he's considered a top 2 heavyweight in the whole planet. Champion Tommy Burns was fighting a lot, but he had won the previously vacant title from Marvin Hart, who had fought for the vacant title and beat Jack Root to get the vacant title when Jim Jeffries retired undefeated. Jim Jeffries, who later came back years later and lost to the great Jack Johnson in what was basically the white champion who retired undefeated. And Jack Johnson had beaten Tommy Burns in 1908 to take the world title that had been previous to, the new iteration of the title. And he had been the colored champion when he beat Tommy Burns. So it was basically the colored champion, the reigning world champion against the unretired, undefeated champion. And that's why the fight with Jim Jeffries was so enormous, and partly why race riots resulted from the result. A lot of fragility came out, and post Reconstruction, there's a lot of insecurity in the general public, and so regardless of what the sports fans wanted, the public in the U.S., there were riots. It was horrible as a result of that fight, and that was then used as an excuse to deny black fighters just at heavyweight, not the other weights, but at heavyweight, deny them world title shots until Joe Louis in the 30s. I mean, it's pretty sick. And it's also so why I would count the colored titles, because one, they were reported in the press as separate titles. So they were world titles, world colored title. And at heavyweight specifically, the white title, other than Jack Johnson's reign, was the white title until Joe Louis. So that's why I count those titles, because some of the greatest fighters of all time had to fight for those titles because they couldn't get an opportunity because people would draw the color line. So, Langford, his resume, I mean, he was a 5-time world heavyweight champion for the colored heavyweight champion. So he has dozens of fights for that title, and it's a serious thing because the guys he was fighting, Harry Wills, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, are also all-time great fighters. And but this is so early in his career, and he's learning from a former colored heavyweight champion who himself fought above his weight because he was really a middleweight, George Byers. And he was learning from the bantamweight, Jimmy Walsh. But so he had the technique. He learned his left hook, his infamous left hook. George Byers showed him how to set his weight and just snap that left hook. And there's a great video, I can't remember what it's called, on YouTube, that on Sugar Ray Robinson, how he would snap his left hook at the last moment to multiply the damage and multiply the concussive force of his punch. Well, that was something Langford was doing decades before. And he learned that from George Byers, who was doing it before him. That's an old technique where you flare your elbow at the last moment and it multiplies the leverage that the impact that you're actually creating on the draw, the speed, the effective speed of the punch. But Josh, let me throw it back to you. In his earliest parts of his career, do you think it's fair to say that his toughest fights in that first full season of 1903 would be probably Belfield Walcott, the welterweight champion's brother, who was a capable lightweight, Andy Watson, the professor, who was another top lightweight, and then Patsy Sweeney, who was sort of a lightweight / welterweight, who was further into his career but had been a top guy, and then Jack Blackburn, the great Jack Blackburn, defensive master, Philly fighter, and then Joe Gans. Do you think those guys would probably represent the toughest challenges he had in that opening season?
Hey, Random. So yeah, that's a tough question right there. As far as some of those names, I haven't even dug into research on. Of course, I know that you would have more information on, but I know for sure that Jack Blackburn and Joe Gans were two that are some of the top tier when you think about the sports history and what they were able to accomplish. Of course, Joe Gans becoming the world lightweight champion, first African American world lightweight champion, as a matter of fact. And also Jack Blackburn, who within his career had a murder conviction. So it was really kind of broken up. But that being said, he still was a great fighter and able to have great accomplishments, great fights prior to and afterwards. And of course, we know he went on to become a Hall of Fame trainer. So there's a lot of tricks up his sleeve, tricks to the trade, all of those things he learned, he took with him. So I'd imagine with Langford fighting the likes of those two early in his career, that paid dividends for him as he moved forward, because you're going to learn a great deal just from those two alone. But thinking about Belfield Walcott, I don't know a ton about him outside of him being Barbados Joe Walcott's brother. So I can only imagine what Belfield Walcott would have learned and sort of took with him by virtue of Barbados Joe being his brother. So you can only imagine what, maybe if they were sparring or if they were training together just in general, you can only imagine what he was able to take from him, or they were essentially able to take from each other. So he definitely is someone who would be of note and I think would have been a benefit to him. Patsy Sweeney is a name that I've seen thrown out there. I'd imagine that would have been a benefit of him, or a benefit to him as well. And I think the big piece of this, just overall, when thinking about it, is when you look at those guys back then and the amount of times they fought, realistically, there was probably a piece of something that you could take from all of them, especially when you weigh it as far as kind of what we see today, where a lot of fighters, they may have showcase fights or fights that they are most certainly intended to win as they're building up their career. But back then, a lot of these guys, they didn't get that opportunity in the same manner, or at least they were kind of just thrown into the deep end or thrown into the fire straight from the start of their career. And we have countless tales and stories of such. And then just the number of times they fought and just the intensity surrounding it, just given the times. I think that kind of takes into account just how much one could gain just over the course of a few years being a fighter during those times. So I would certainly imagine that all of the individuals you named, even those that I'm not versed on, provided some benefit to Sam Langford, and just the sheer number of fights we saw him ultimately get to in his career, at least from what is sort of documented. We're talking about an individual who, in all likelihood, is in that 300 plus fight club. And when you think about that, you just know that what he probably learned on the way, many fighters would have forgotten, or he's forgotten more than what some of these fighters of today will ever learn, which was the case with a lot of those guys back then, because you can't replace the experience. I know, of course, times have changed and things are the way they are, but certainly that pro experience for them back then, which for a lot of them, the majority of their experience came in the pro ranks. I mean, that is something that sort of helps to build you as a fighter, and certainly Langford is right there in the mix as it relates to that. So big ups to those fighters who often go unnoticed, unheralded, don't get much mention, if any at all, who help to build these great champions into the fighters that they ultimately become.
Yeah, heck yeah, brother. Well said. Well said. Big up BL in the chat, and Happy New Year, H and Rodolfo, Lane, everybody. Just thanks for coming by, folks. You know, it's nice to see you live. I know some of you are in the UK. I know BL's in the UK, but it's just nice to get together and talk a little bit about this stuff. It's all distant in the distant past, but for me, I get a huge thrill out of peeling back the veil of history. I do watch today's boxing, but I'm very casual. I don't even watch all the title fights. I just watch what I can fit in between my mixed martial arts passion. I'm a huge stand for the Bellator org. In fact, I'm still trying to recover from New Year's Eve, overnight, the early part of New Year's Eve started at midnight here. right the start of New Year's Eve. But in Japan, they're 14 hours ahead from my time zone. So I brought in New Year's Eve with Japan, with Bellator MMA taking on 5 of the top Japanese, fighters in Japan, I should say, that fight in Japan under the ring rules. So it was cage MMA versus ring MMA under the superior rule set, which allows soccer kicks and stomps and all kinds of extra techniques. And Bellator swept it 5-0, and it was an 8-hour show. I watched 8 hours of one card. There were 15 fights, and of the first 8 fights, which was just within the Ryzen organization, 8 of them were finishes, 8 finishes in a row. And then it was opened with a decision, 8 finishes, a decision. All the Bellator fights went to decision, but they were incredibly exciting to see these athletes go into an unfamiliar rule set. Now, to relate that back to Langford, he fought in a lot of different rule sets, different versions. So sometimes the ref would have a certain opinion about what constituted a win and what sort of action they expected and what they wouldn't allow. At many times, Langford was able to kidney punch in fights, but other refs wouldn't allow it. Oftentimes, Langford was able to hold and hit, like clinch fighting, but other refs wouldn't allow it. And when he fought in England, you weren't allowed to hold and hit. You had to. It was not just a clean break and no hitting on the break, and like you see in the center top there, where he has to stand off to let the opponent rise. He couldn't stand over them, as was the case in many of the places in America. But he also, you couldn't. There was no clinching allowed, let alone punching while you clinched. You weren't allowed to clinch at all. You had to just, because people would wrench the arm and things like that. Jack Johnson was a genius with that. So that was, clinching could be its own offensive weapon as far as attacking someone's physical form. Langford fought under that. When he fought in Australia, it's the same thing. No holding and hitting. Langford fought different round lengths. He fought under different rules. He fought with different gloves. When he fought Bill Lang in London, he used the promoter, Bill Lang's promoter, and also the event promoter had some extra padded gloves that they used. Langford still beat him all over the ring. Bill Lang, here he is right here, eating a left hook. But so Langford, he fought different versions. It wasn't as standardized in those days, but I find it fascinating, even if it makes it harder to draw direct comparisons between different athletes and eras. I find it fascinating, the differences and the adaptability. And I think Langford's early experience under different rules, different judging criteria, different kinds of opponents, different sizes, was part of why that, and his inherent toughness and his drive, was why he was able to build basically the greatest resume in the history of boxing, the toughest CV. As far as successful part of the CV, him and Harry Greb, I personally feel him and Harry Greb are out front, but also like Sugar Ray Robinson, the great Hank Armstrong, they're up there as well. Tony Canzoneri has a ridiculous resume. There's some other guys who fought just an incredible amount of high-level fighters. Maxie Rosenblum, as far as the ratings era, thanks to Boxing Librarian, we know he has the most wins and the most fights against ranked fighters who were ranked at some point in their career at some weight. But, so there's some giant resumes out there. But Langford's, when you go up to the Hall of Fame level, no one has even nearly as many fights at the Hall of Fame level as him. And that's what separates him, and he has a lot of draws in there, else he would probably have the most wins. And then he also had some opponents like Jeff Clark, Dave Hawley, young Peter Jackson, George Cole, who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, who aren't inducted into the Hall of Fame, don't seem to come up, but should be in there. So if those guys got their due credit, Langford's Hall of Fame numbers would be even more absurd. As it is, they're crazy. If you want to learn more about his Hall of Fame numbers, just search Hardline Boxing Talk, Sam Langford, and just enjoy one of those great videos by BL. You'll get all that information. Because a lot of documentaries won't tell you about the colored heavyweight title lineage, but it was important, and it was especially important in Langford because one of his initial trainers, George Byers, in the center there, but also one of his later trainers and one of the powerful sparring partners and training partners of the era, Bob Armstrong, was also a colored heavyweight champion. So Langford was trained by 2 colored heavyweight champions. He fought the reigning colored heavyweight champion in 1906, Jack Johnson, who went on to become one of the greatest overall heavyweight champions of all time. And he was truly undisputed. However you look at it, Jack Johnson, he was the colored heavyweight champion. He beat the world champion Tommy Burns, who'd won the previously vacant title, once removed from it being vacant. and then he beat the undefeated lineal champion Jeffries. So Johnson was, even though people were already fighting for the colored title the year, once he stiffed Langford on the fight in May 1909, they started all fighting amongst themselves for the new colored heavyweight title. But Johnson in 1910, when he beat Jeffries, even though he'd been retired a while, he had beaten the man to become the man. He'd also beaten the guy who left when he was the man. So, but Langford, he was trained by champions. He became a champion. He had a ridiculous number of fights for that. He also fought a bunch of the top white fighters. He wasn't just fighting, colored fighters. And so he had an inordinate amount of fights against all manner of boxers, all different levels, including the highest level, contenders, guys that other guys had beaten either as the champion or beat to get a title shot themselves. I mean, Langford's so woven into the early era. It's just really remarkable. I know you know this too, Josh, but just wanted to give a quick shout. I know that you have to go. You have to work in the morning. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to Georgie Byers there on the left, Bob Armstrong on the right, and also there in the bottom center, the great Bob Fitzsimmons, Langford's idol. In his memoirs in 1924, he said that it was because, Bob shared a name with his father, with Langford's father, but it was probably also because he was like this little man warrior. Fitzsimmons he was kind of lanky, but he wasn't very heavy. Like you said, he was doing really well at the highest level. Even sometimes in fights, he ended up losing. Fitzsimmons was incredible, and Langford went on to be described widely as the hardest hitter of his generation, as Bob Fitzsimmons had been. Neither of these guys were particularly heavy. Well, they were particularly not heavy, but they weren't particularly large in any dimension to be considered the hardest hitter. But this was a time when it was hard to get props. So Langford getting props in the press like this, as Langford succeeds Fitz the hardest hitter, that wasn't easy to come by. There were lots of guys having great seasons. Now, Josh, I know we're about to wrap this up, and I know we touched on a lot more than just what we initially intended to, went on some rambles, which is inevitable with a fighter as great as Langford. But we did touch on his remarkable early career. We talked about he stayed with a ridiculous schedule late in his career. Like this right here is 2 seasons after the season when he lost sight in one eye. Look at all those fights he had in 1 year. That's just 1 year. And he was giving up size in some of those fights, whether it was height, reach, or actual weight. He was giving up some of all of it in these different fights. He lost sight in one eye against Fred Fulton in mid 1917. This is his 1920 season. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the difficulty of his schedule. But even early in his career, before he'd fought any world-class fighters, he fought, like we said, turned pro in April 1902. But 1903, when he came back and he started fighting in January, he'd had 3 fights by the end of January. He'd had 6 fights by the end of February, we know now, at least 6, and 9 fights by the end of March. And he wasn't even going yet. This was just a warm-up for him. And he probably had a lot of other fights that I'll dig up over time. We'll have to see. We'll have to see what we find. But he's not the only fighter to fight a tough schedule like this, like a busy schedule, but most people burn out after a few years. Maybe they do this for 3 or 4 years. They get some high-level fights. Then they're broken-bodied, and they take steps back. Langford just kept getting better and better and better to where, like I said, by the end of 1908, him and Jack Johnson are the top heavyweights in the world, but Langford can still fight middleweights. He can still easily make middleweight. Just the middleweights largely won't fight him by 1908. So he's fighting a lot at heavyweight. And, he did a tremendous amount, even though he doesn't get his full credit today, but we're working to try and change that. And also the internet, we're still getting deeper and deeper in the internet age where people have access to information. So certain fighters like Sam Langford, Harry Greb, Azar Charles, some of these fighters, they're now getting closer to their full credit than they got maybe after their memory started to fade after their initial thing. Langford's memory, it took a while to fade. It wasn't like they immediately forgot him in 26 when he retired. He was hugely celebrated after that. It's one of my favorite pictures. Sam Langford comes to Joe Lewis's camp, and Lewis is trained on Blackburn and fought Langford multiple times. Lewis, idolized Langford. Langford was considered to have hit as hard as Joe Louis by Jack Blackburn, even though he was like 15 or 20 pounds lighter than the slim version of Joe Louis, who was the killer. Louis got even heavier later. So Langford was a tiny person to be generating that kind of power. He had no right to generate that power, but he also had the chin to go with it because he wasn't expected. People were betting on whether Langford would last the 15 rounds against Johnson, not whether he would win. He was the underdog to win, obviously, but he was also an underdog to last the rounds. with 15, they cheered him, even though he got his eye closed. And they actually fought. They did a little exhibition just days later at a charity event. So Langford was tough. He was special tough. He's definitely worth celebrating. We're gonna do a lot more of this on the channel. I wanted to break that fight. Joshua, do you want to add anything about his first year, maybe just the 1903, his first full season? That obviously he closed out the New England champion. He closed out with a win over one of the all-time greats, Joe Gans. And he had also, right after this article came out, Jack Blackburn got the best of him, although it was officially a draw. It was a prearranged draw on the insistence of Langford's people, it turns out, that I saw in the archive. They insisted that if it went the distance, it would be a draw. But a loss in spirit. He beat an all-time great, and then he had a loss in spirit to another great stylist of the early era. Jack Blackburn was brilliant. Just look at how Joe Louis fights. His mentor, Jack Blackburn. And Blackburn's experience against Langford, Blackburn held Langford in tremendous regard, to where he thought Joe Louis would have beaten Jack Johnson, but lost to Sam Langford, to a prime Sam Langford. That's how good Jack Blackburn thought Langford was, and few would know better. He spent a lot of rounds in the ring with him. Would you like to add anything about that initial full season that he had, that remarkable season?
I think you actually summed it up pretty well, Random, just to be honest. Yeah, if anything, I would just say that sometimes the fights with Blackburn or that in specific, that fight, it may go unnoticed because Blackburn isn't a name that is mentioned widely, but definitely looking into his career, and I have done a video on him, he is certainly one of the just hardest boxers, and I mean just a true man that the sport has seen, and he fought his way to where he ended up, of course, being the trainer of Joe Louis, but just to get there, he had to go through a gauntlet. And I think it speaks volumes that individuals like Jack Blackburn are the type of fighters that Langford had to take on throughout his career leading up to heavyweight, because there were some heavyweights who were of a similar ilk. Thinking about Sam McVeigh, who I have something coming on, or I have a video of him coming fairly soon. And you just think about those types of fighters and the fact that Langford, who started at these lower weights, ultimately ended up there, as I was mentioning in the beginning of this video. I think that speaks volumes to how tough he was and just how he viewed himself as well as a boxer. When we talk about legacy, I think he's the definition of the word. Many can mention such, but the old adage goes, actions speak louder than words. And with Langford, it was always action.
Yes, sir, it definitely was. Of all those fights he had, very few of them were crappy fights. He did have a few fights that were stopped for inactivity. Again, the refs were really harsh in these days. So he faced George Cole, and after 4 rounds, the ref called it off. He had a fight, I believe, with Sam McVeigh that was like that. How sometimes happen, the refs there was a high standard. I'm not saying the standards have slipped now, but the relationship between the different elements in boxing and pugilism have changed over the generations. I'll just put it that way. But Langford, and I just want to give a quick shout out to the great Stanley Ketchel. Ketchel was cut down in his prime, or although he had been partying a little bit, so I don't know if he was still in his absolute peak, but he was still in his 20s. He was shot to death on his farm by the hired help, and I think over a woman, and it was a complicated issue. But Ketchel fought the great Jack Johnson, but as great as Ketchel was, he actually drew the color line on Langford, then raised it for a booking. The fight was called off. Then he fought Johnson, and he knocked down Jack Johnson in the fight, and then Johnson jumped up and just hit him with bombs and just completely flatlined him. But Ketchel had enough power to knock down Jack Johnson. Langford fought him for 6 rounds. It was thought that Langford was carrying Ketchel because he was trying to angle for, they would only fight him in a no decision state in a short fight. He wanted a long fight for the title, 25 rounds in California, where the big money was. It was going to be in a custom built stadium. Ketchel threw everything at Langford, and still it was said Langford was taking it easy on him and took everything. He had the chin to go with his power. He wasn't he wasn't a glass cannon. He was a steel cannon. So Langford could take it and he could give it. But also shout out to Stanley Ketchel for fighting Jack Johnson. And Langford took 15 rounds of punishment from Jack Johnson, who flatlined Ketchel. But he took it from Johnson in his 20s. By the time Ketchel fought him, Johnson was in his 30s. He was getting a little bit past. He was getting a little heavier set. He wasn't as fast, even though he was brilliant. Langford took it from Johnson in 1906. Johnson had won the colored heavyweight title from Denver Ed Martin, Colorado Giant, in 1903. So he was a few years into his reign as the colored world heavyweight champion. And Langford, as a little guy, as a tiny person, took 15 rounds of hell and finished the fight on his feet. That's partly why he got cheered. So that chin of Langford's, as well as his power, was partly why fighters, even great fighters like Ketchel, wouldn't fight him in a long fight that were his own size, or they just wouldn't fight him at all. And I've got clippings. I'll do an article on all the different poems and articles I've found of fighters being mocked by the press for avoiding Langford. And it even went up to heavyweight, where Langford was chasing Johnson, and a lot of the other white contenders just didn't want to know. Langford was fighting all the best black fighters, and then he was also fighting the white guys who had the guts to get in there, and they were largely a draw was the best they could hope for. And they did sometimes get the draw, but largely they just lost. Langford was just a special beast of a fighter. But even early in his career, it was a tough proposition. He fought some serious dudes. You know, people who were recognized as pretty serious talent, and got the best of them, as well as, you know, styles make fights. So like, you know, when he fought Johnny Johnson, you know, that was a draw. And Johnson had a size advantage, but that, you know, that same year he beat better fighters than Johnson. The way the particulars line up and the length of the fight has a lot to do with the results. But anyway, folks, Josh absolutely must go to sleep. I'm torturing him here, holding him awake. So we can upgrade Langford from 27 to 28 bouts for the year officially, although we don't have a result for that one. And that would make the combined records of, because he was at lightweight, that would make the combined records of four of the top lightweights, including the champion Gans of that year. Gans, Langford, Holly, and Blackburn, 82 bouts. 4 men, 82 bouts in 1 year. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about people fighting once a year, twice a year, or as a prospect fighting 5 times a year and then backing it off when they get to the high level. Langford came racing out of the gate once he started his career in proper in January 1903. You know, once he fully went into the schedule, he never left it. And at that point, his slow years were still busy by today, insanely busy by today's standards. And he kept his speed for many, many years. So he had power, chin, and speed and technique, because he was sharpening his technique against Walsh. Walsh was faster than him, even though they could never have fought. But he wasn't just slugging it out. He was the opposite of a slugger. He was an assassin, and he was so good that he would, he was fighting a lot of opponents, he'd try to finish him with the right straight, because a lot of the press would celebrate that punch, and he didn't want it to get out there too much. The left hook was his real danger punch. A lot of people knew, but not everyone knew. And he would carry people, sometimes just part of the fight, so some bets would come in. His manager could take some bets, and then he would polish them off. Sometimes it went wrong. Like, it was thought he was carrying Jim Flynn in a close newspaper decision loss. Went one newspaper either way, and the ref said he favored Flynn, so we counted as a Flynn win. That was in 1910. But then 5 weeks later, they fought again in a long bout, and Langford stopped him. And he'd already wiped him out in a round in 1908. But the second time they met, Flynn got a little bit the edge. But I don't think Langford meant to let people think that Flynn was better than him. It was just that he didn't want to finish him off and then not get a long fight for a big purse. They did get the long fight 5 weeks later, and that's actually on video, folks. You can go see that. You can go watch Sam Langford versus Fireman Jim Flynn Part 3. Go check that out. Check out 86 Boxing, and definitely check out Hardline Boxing Talk and Scrapbook Boxing Museum of Forgotten Fisticuffs. big up Scrap. Love those videos you've been putting out, and it's just very exciting to hear the work that you're doing. I won't give spoilers for anybody, but go check out his channel. His last 4 or 5 videos, watch all of that. Just great boxing history. So Josh, thank you for joining me to talk about this incredible pugilist and just putting up with me ranting and raving about this stuff. I'm so hyped that I found this. We found it. We did it, folks. I've been studying this guy for several years in a row, but I found a fight. I thought I'd found some before, but it turned out they were ones that there's no record, at least that I found so far, of a result. Either because someone else fought him that night, or because it was canceled. And they didn't necessarily mention that it was canceled. It's just there's no mention of it in the results in the paper. We're working with incomplete information, but that's part of the fun of this whole thing. We're just peeling back the veil of history. So Josh, any final thoughts? If you're not already asleep on the phone, any final thoughts for the people?
I dropped it in the chat, but I just want to say thanks to everyone who joined in at this particular time, and of course those who will be watching on replay. This is a historic moment. At least I view it as a historic moment in the art of research for Random Acoustic Thoughts here. So big props to him. This is the type of stuff that helps to push the sport and the history of the sport forward. And I'd imagine that there's probably many more to come, just given the amount of research that you put in. And again, thank you for inviting me to share in this history. It's truly appreciated. And I look forward to our further discussions on the great Boston Bone Crusher.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, I'm just closing out the show. There's Langford there in one of his training robes. This is from a 1911 fight against Bill Lang, who was a heavyweight contender. And this was actually the 3 fights that there's, I'm sorry, 2 of the 3 pieces of remaining footage we have are from fights that Hugh McIntosh, the Australian promoter, filmed. And there's actually a 3rd fight. His first fight with Sam McVeigh in April of the year after, in this same year, April of 1911, was filmed. I've seen articles advertising Langford was going to do talks over the footage of the McVeigh fight. I'm assuming a highlight just like this is, but it didn't happen. But I just want to throw this up. There's Bill Lang right there. He had a good 30 pounds on Langford, and he got battered all over the ring. He fouled out, but it was a mercy stoppage. It was an absolute bloodbath, to the point where one boxing writer he actually recommended the white fighters draw the color line tight, because no one was going to be Langford or Johnson or Jeanette or McVeigh. None of the white guys. He said, draw the line tight and get some of these white boys and get them a ton of experience. Basically mimic what these men did to create their incredible prowess. So that's it, folks. I just wanted to play the last little bit. Thanks for joining us, and keep an eye open for more content with myself and 86 Boxing. Also, me as a solo, and we'll also hopefully I'll get another countdown going with Scrapbook Boxing and the Boxing Librarian for you all. So thanks for joining in. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or nighttime, whatever it is where you are. And we'll catch you soon. Thanks again, Josh. And take care, everybody.